Welcome to Stories Room. Enjoy listening and don't forget to subscribe. Andrew and Alice had long appeared to everyone around them as the perfect suburban couple. Their modest two-story house with a neat garden, their quiet street, and the two children, Daniel and Kathy, seemed to paint a picture of complete family bliss. Andrew worked as a purchasing manager in a large company, while Alice was a freelance interior designer, juggling her time between online projects and caring for the children. In the evenings, they would gather around the dinner table, talk about school or the office, and everything looked so harmonious that no outsider would ever guess there could be cracks beneath the surface. Yet those cracks had started to form well before Alice's secret affair. On many nights, Andrew came home later than usual, looking worn out and distant. Alice tried to understand his mood swings, asking if anything was wrong, but his responses were always short and guarded, as though he preferred to keep everything to himself. She sensed his growing withdrawal and felt uneasy about it. In her mind, she told herself that every couple goes through phases of routine and boredom, and that perhaps he was just tired or stressed. Still, a subtle unease built up inside her, as if foreshadowing that something would go terribly wrong. Andrew's best friend since school was David, a more impulsive and adventurous man who had never married and seemed to enjoy a carefree lifestyle. Where Andrew was methodical and serious, David was spontaneous, always ready to have fun, and never afraid to push limits. In earlier years, all three of them, Andrew, Alice, and David, would occasionally meet at parties or barbecues, though Alice never felt deeply connected to David. They were friendly enough, but she mostly saw him as Andrew's wild, slightly irresponsible friend, until one day, David began appearing in their lives more frequently. At first, it was the occasional, "Hey, I was in the area, thought I'd drop by," or "Need help with anything around the house?" Andrew seemed to appreciate these visits, though he was also overwhelmed by work and didn't always have time to hang out. What Alice began to notice was that David's attitude toward her had changed. He was full of compliments, he offered assistance with little tasks, and he was flirtatious in a way she hadn't expected. When he praised her designs or casually mentioned how striking she looked, she felt a flutter inside. Things she longed to hear from Andrew, who seemed more and more emotionally absent. One evening, David dropped by unannounced while Andrew was still at work. They shared a bottle of wine, talking about everything from design ideas to her childhood memories, and soon the conversation took on a tension that made Alice's heart race. She felt guilty. She knew this was crossing a line, but the loneliness she had been feeling grew so strong that his attention felt like a lifeline. Then, as she walked him to the door, he kissed her. She should have pushed him away, told him never to do that again. Instead, she found herself responding. In the days that followed, Alice could barely sleep. She told herself it had been a mistake, that she would never let it happen again. But she kept thinking about David's voice in her ear, the warmth of his hands. The next time he visited, the tension between them was palpable, and their attraction was undeniable. One evening, when Andrew was out of town for a work event, and the children were at their grandmother's, Alice surrendered to that attraction fully. She and David were alone in the living room, conversation burning with unspoken desire, and before she knew it, they were locked in a passionate embrace on the couch. Conflicting emotions raged inside her: guilt, excitement, a sense of finally being alive again. By the time she realized how far it had gone, there was no turning back. Though she tried to keep the affair secret, Andrew soon sensed that something was off. He noticed Alice's distant gaze, her refusal to engage him in the usual small talk, and her sudden preoccupation with her phone. A terrifying suspicion crept into his mind, something he didn't want to admit. He tried to push that suspicion aside until, one evening, an unintended glance at Alice's unlocked phone revealed a string of messages between her and David, messages that left no room for doubt. He felt his whole world collapse in a single moment. Rage, betrayal, and heartbreak swirled inside him, stronger than he had ever experienced. But rather than confront her on the spot, he decided to wait, to see if he could catch them in the act and confirm what the messages implied. That confirmation came late one evening, when Andrew returned home unexpectedly. He had told Alice he would be away on business, but his gut told him to drive back. The house was unusually silent downstairs, yet he noticed the warm glow of a lamp from an upstairs window. He crept up the stairs, heart pounding, and found the bedroom door half open. Stepping forward, Andrew saw exactly what he had dreaded. Alice and David, tangled in each other's arms on the bed. Alice, stunned, tried to cover herself, while David practically fell to the floor in a scramble to find his clothes. Shocked to his core, Andrew stood there, fists clenched, words choking in his throat. Eventually, all that came out was a quiet, seething statement. "How could you both do this to me?" Then, controlling the urge to lash out physically, he told David in a grim, icy voice to leave and never come near the house again. David, grabbing his shirt and coat, rushed out in shame, while Alice was left trembling, pleading with Andrew to let her explain. Andrew could not bear to hear her excuses. He packed an overnight bag and left, slamming the front door behind him with such force that the windows rattled. He spent the night in a cheap motel, unable to sleep, staring at the ceiling as flashbacks of that bedroom scene replayed endlessly in his mind. Anger gradually gave way to a cold, calculating resolve. If they had dared to betray him, he would ensure that both paid dearly for it. He was not a man to forgive easily, and now he was consumed by a desire for vengeance. In the weeks that followed, Andrew's fury smoldered as he planned his next steps. He realized that tearing the family apart in a public screaming match might bring short-term satisfaction but would destroy his children's lives. Instead, he decided to carefully gather information and build a case. He went through Alice's phone records, took screenshots of her messages with David, and quietly prepared for a legal fight he knew was coming. Meanwhile, Alice lived in a state of constant anxiety, sensing that Andrew's cold silence was more threatening than any explosive confrontation. Whenever he did speak to her, it was clipped and businesslike, focused on the children or household logistics. She knew she had lost whatever love he once felt for her. Despite the tension, they continued living under the same roof for a short time. Alice tried to apologize, to explain that she had felt ignored, unseen, and lonely. She tried to say it had been a terrible mistake. Andrew would merely stare at her through narrowed eyes and respond, "Don't talk to me about mistakes. You made your choice." They slept in separate rooms, barely interacting except in front of Daniel and Kathy, who seemed puzzled by the sudden chill in the house. The children sensed that something was very wrong, but they were too young to understand. One afternoon, Alice realized that she could not endure the situation any longer. She called David and demanded they meet somewhere inconspicuous. They drove to a deserted parking lot and argued in the car. She felt increasingly guilty, blaming both herself and him for the devastation they had caused. David said he truly loved her, that he had never meant to break up her marriage, yet here they were. They ended up in each other's arms, weeping in the car for what they had done, and yet neither seemed able to turn back. Soon, Andrew moved beyond silent fury and filed for divorce. He wanted to keep control over the house and, above all, the children. He retained a sharp-witted lawyer who advised him on how to present the affair as evidence that Alice was an unfit mother. Andrew did not want to hurt Daniel and Kathy, but he justified his actions by telling himself that he was simply protecting them from a mother who had put her own desires ahead of her family. Alice hired her own lawyer, hoping to secure custody of the children and at least some share of the property. She admitted her infidelity but refused to accept the idea that one mistake erased her identity as a loving mother. The day Andrew formally served her with divorce papers, Alice felt the ground crumble beneath her. She saw that Andrew had included transcripts of her messages with David and threatened to supply eyewitness accounts if needed. He was determined to show the court that she had recklessly endangered the children's well-being by carrying on with his best friend. She feared losing Daniel and Kathy more than anything else. She confided in David, who encouraged her to fight, to gather her own evidence of Andrew's long absences and the times she alone took care of the children. But every time she considered leaning on David more, she realized how damaging that could look in court. Eventually, the divorce proceedings began in earnest. They battled over custody, property rights, and spousal support. Andrew insisted that, due to Alice's immoral behavior, he should be granted full custody. He claimed that her ongoing relationship with David was proof she placed her personal desires above the children's stability. Alice's lawyer countered that a marital affair, while painful and ethically wrong, did not make a woman incapable of parenting. She emphasized that Alice was deeply involved in Daniel's schooling, always taking Kathy to her art lessons and medical checkups, and had been the one maintaining a loving routine for them. Andrew's lawyer claimed that Andrew was a fully capable parent, and that, in any case, the family home belonged mostly to him due to his financial contributions and inheritance. At one point, Andrew hired a private investigator to follow Alice. He hoped to catch her meeting David and to present photographs or records that might show she was neglecting the children. Alice discovered she was being followed when a suspicious stranger approached, offering to help carry groceries to her car, then vanished as soon as she declined. Paranoia made her glance over her shoulder everywhere she went. Andrew, on the other hand, felt a grim satisfaction whenever he heard the investigator report sightings of Alice sneaking away to see David. Yes, Andrew thought, the court will see this and know she's unreliable. Meanwhile, living together had become impossible. One evening, Alice left the house, taking Daniel and Kathy with her, and rented a small, shabby apartment in a less desirable part of town. She wanted peace for herself and the children, away from Andrew's accusing eyes. She knew he could still attempt to show the court that moving the children into a cramped place was irresponsible, but she could not bear the constant hostility in their old home. David offered to let her stay with him, but she refused, fearing that would give Andrew the perfect weapon against her. She thought it best to show that she could be independent, even though financial stability was slipping through her fingers. Andrew took the opportunity to paint himself as the more stable parent, living in the family home with space and resources for the children. He invited social workers to assess the house, making sure everything was tidy and child-friendly. He started coming home earlier and cooking dinner, telling them, "My kids are my priority." When they visited him, Daniel and Kathy indeed enjoyed the larger space, the yard, and their own familiar bedrooms. Alice watched in silent anguish, worried the children might begin to prefer staying with Andrew, though they still loved her. Every time the two parents arranged drop-offs and pickups, tensions flared. Andrew would arrive with a policeman or a social worker, determined to show that Alice was the aggressive, unreliable one. Some evenings, he would keep the children longer than scheduled, ignoring her frantic messages until late at night. Every step of the process hurt Daniel and Kathy, who were confused by the sudden rift between their parents and unsure why they had to shuttle back and forth between two places. Finally, the court began to converge on the main issues: which parent would be granted primary custody, and how the property, especially the family house, would be divided. Andrew presented receipts and documents proving that most of the money for the mortgage came from his salary and some inheritance from his parents. He also showed text messages implicating Alice's ongoing involvement with David, implying that the children might be at risk of psychological stress. Alice's lawyer countered with testimonies from teachers, neighbors, and pediatricians who attested that Alice was a caring, attentive mother, that the affair never endangered her children, and that Andrew, for years, was mostly absent from day-to-day parenting. Despite the strong arguments on both sides, it was clear that Andrew had the upper hand financially and was more than willing to fight aggressively. When the final hearing arrived, the judge announced his decision. The marriage was to be dissolved. Custody of Daniel and Kathy would be shared between mother and father, with the children officially living with their mother but seeing their father on a regular, court-established schedule. And the family home would remain with Andrew due to the substantial evidence of his larger investment in the property. Alice would receive a cash settlement to compensate her partial contribution, plus child support, though Andrew argued to lower the support amount due to allegedly reduced income. The judge allowed a slight reduction in child support, but left the settlement mostly intact. Alice and Andrew both felt unsatisfied in different ways. Andrew had wanted full custody, but was still pleased that he kept the house and managed to reduce his financial obligations. Alice was relieved. She did not lose her children, but grieved the loss of the home she had poured her heart into for years. She found herself with only a modest apartment, a small settlement, and a routine that still required her to coordinate with Andrew so the children could visit him frequently. The bitterness Andrew harbored for her never seemed to ease. If anything, the final stage of the legal battle only deepened his sense that he had punished her but was still haunted by her betrayal. David attempted to support Alice through all of this, sometimes offering her funds to cover legal bills or basic expenses. She accepted some help but worried about exchanging one form of dependence for another. Late at night, in that cramped apartment, she would watch her children sleep and wonder if she had made the right choices. When memories surfaced of the passion she felt with David, she questioned whether it had been worth the devastation it caused. Andrew, in the large, quiet house, felt his revenge was complete. He had made sure his former best friend and wife paid dearly for their disloyalty. Yet the silent rooms reminded him of a time when the place was filled with laughter. He refused to let that nostalgia soften him. He justified everything by recalling how they had betrayed him in the worst possible way. David realized that life with Alice might never be simple. Though he believed he truly cared for her, he saw how the baggage of her marriage, children, and custody battles had drained her spirit. Their relationship, once fueled by thrilling secrecy, turned complicated and heavy. Sometimes he wondered if they could ever build a peaceful life together, or if their love story was fated to remain a painful reminder of betrayal and consequences. In the end, Alice did move on in some ways. She returned to doing design work, bit by bit regaining her footing, determined to provide for Daniel and Kathy and prove she could stand on her own. She remained in a complex relationship with David, neither fully embracing a new life with him nor pushing him away completely. Andrew kept the house, living with the echo of what used to be a family home, telling himself he had every right to remain angry. He saw the children regularly, taking them for weekends or holidays, reminding them that he had not abandoned them and that this was still their real home. Daniel and Kathy adapted as best they could to the two-house reality, bearing the scars of conflict but still loved by both parents. So their story ended with no clear winners, only survivors of a painful drama. Alice lost nearly everything except her children. Andrew never found true healing for his heartbreak, and David discovered that love emerging from deception can bring its own anguish. Perhaps, in time, each would find a path to peace, but for now, they lived day by day with the knowledge that a single betrayal and an act of vengeance can unravel lives in ways no one can fully control. That's the end of our story. Make sure to subscribe to our channel to stay up to date on new stories and share this video so others can discover these great stories too.